Hey everybody, welcome back. Today I hope you have an opportunity. Well, I know you have the opportunity because you're here right now. Well, I hope you have an opportunity to go through this, to take your time today. This is our second video book and it is titled In Defense of the Unknowable Name, a linguistic, textual manuscript and historical argument against the Hebrew Tetragrammaton as the creator's original revealed name. So before we jump in, I want to first go ahead and start with the word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we just thank you today that you've assembled us in this place. Father, there is no distance in the spirit. So we're gathering together today, and you said where there are two or three gathered together that I am in the midst. So we thank you for your Holy Spirit that will lead and guide us into all truth. Father, I pray that you bless all of us as we go through this and as we open our minds, and that we remain flexible as your Holy Spirit leads us and guide us. Father, we only seek to please you. Help enable us to become and continue to be like the Bereans, that we research and we read and we stay open to what your Spirit is saying unto us. Father, again, bless the hearers as well as myself, and we thank you again this day, for it is in your Son's name we pray. Amen. Now, everybody, today, this is just, again, an opportunity for the second video book. So this is what I want to first tell you why I'm actually presenting this. I was just led, again, I don't know if you've heard any of my previous videos, but I've been like delving into the name for like at least the last 6 years. And so I just want to share with you a journey where I'm at on my journey. I have gone through a lot of winding roads and, felt like, okay, I know, or I felt like, okay, this is the revelation. And so from that, one thing I found out is that you have to be comfortable with being wrong. You have to be comfortable with wanting to learn and understand something new. Okay, so if you were to even listen to any of my previous videos, even if you went back a month, you would hear something totally different. I don't apologize for that. It's just called learning and progressing on that journey. Okay, I actually don't. We'll never get to a point where we know it all, right? And even what we think we do know, we may get up in glory and find out we were wrong, but we don't want to be wrong about certain things. But I believe as long as we're doing our best to press towards truth. So I'm going to show you where I am now. It's actually kind of shocking to me, but I'm going to give you that title again. This whole perspective is In Defense of the Unknowable Name, a linguistic textual manuscript and historical argument against the Hebrew Tetragrammaton as the creator's original revealed name. Now, if you have never heard of the Tetragrammaton, this might be a little bit overwhelming for you, but let me just tell you, it just means YHWH, or in Hebrew, we would say Yod-Heh, Vav-Heh, or Yod-Heh, okay? And so for the rest of you you're used to this, you've been looking into it, my challenge is to you too as well, is that you use this as a launching pad. And in no way, shape, or form am I claiming to know it all. So I'm presenting information that I hope that you pick up that baton and you dive deeper to either reinforce what you already believe, or to turn the page and look into something else that possibly may be true. Okay, and so we're going to jump in, but let me tell you the format. First, you're just going to go through, listen to this video book. Okay, I don't apologize for anything as far as the time is concerned. He said to his disciples, could you not pray with me for at least 1 hour? And so as Bereans, those of us who are invested in our eternal life, we want to have a practice and the discipline to be able to sit under teaching for at least an hour, okay? Not to be entertained, but to sit under teaching for at least an hour. So with that said, you're going to go through, listen to the video book, and then the next video, just hit the notification bell so you'll know when I put it out, hopefully this week. It will be just my notes where I'll go back and I'll explain it. And what I will do is I will leave this actual link where you can go through and just read it for yourself, take your time, make notes. You can download, I believe I'll put it in PDF form platform where then you can open up one of your PDF annotation apps and you can make notes and mark on it and whatever else, okay? I'm just one of the tools that I believe the Father will use in your life to help lead and guide you. So again, with that said, we're going to jump in. You're going to hear a lot of big words. There might be some words that you don't understand, but again, hold tight. You might want to even listen to it twice. And then when I post my video, I'll go through and I'll highlight some things that I think may just make it a little bit more user friendly when we listen to it. Okay, so if you're ready, we're going to jump straight in, y'all.
This paper advances the multi-layered thesis that the Hebrew Tetragrammaton, YHWH, cannot be conclusively identified as the Creator's original revealed name. The argument proceeds from 9 interlocking pillars. First, the late compilation and multi-source redaction of Exodus undermines its capacity to function as a single eyewitness testimony to a primordial divine naming event. Second, the superior first-person Mosaic authority of Deuteronomy foregrounds divine character and covenant over phonetic designation. Third, what English readers encounter as Lord or Lord in their Bibles is not a translation but a translator's substitution convention. In the Masoretic text tradition the Tetragrammaton appears, but in the Septuagint tradition Kyrios, Lord, appears in identical locations, meaning the frequently cited 6828 occurrence argument is a scribal and editorial phenomenon, not primordial divine self-designation. Fourth, the direct teachings of Christos conspicuously omit the Tetragrammaton and consistently address the Creator as Father, endorsing by quotation practice the Septuagint's Kyrios tradition. Fifth, Hosea 2:16's prophetic rejection of the Lord/Master title category indicts every substitution tradition simultaneously. Sixth, the deep Egyptian ontological concept of the hidden name Ammonius aligns precisely with what the burning bush encounter itself enacts. Seventh, Moses' Egyptian linguistic formation establishes a conceptual framework foreign to tetragrammaton centrism. Eighth, Israel's 430 years of Egyptian immersion renders pure Hebrew an historically implausible original medium for eternal divine revelation. And ninth, across the entire manuscript tradition, what appears is not the Creator's own voice speaking his name, but the accumulated and compounding choices of scribes, translators, and editorial communities across centuries of human transmission. Table of Contents. Abstract. Section 1. The problem of Lord in your Bible, manuscripts, translators, and the word you are actually reading. Section 2. The late compilation of Exodus, a text built by editors, not a single voice. Section 3. Deuteronomy's first-person authority, what Moses actually emphasized. Section 4. Ehyeh asher Ehyeh, a verbal dynamic, not a proper name, and the editorial transformation into YHWH. Section 5. The 6828 occurrences argument, why frequency is not evidence of origin. Section 6. Christos and the divine name, the silence that speaks. Section 7. Hosea 2:16, the prophetic rejection of Lord title theology. Section 8. Ammonius, the hidden one and the ontology of the divine name in Egypt. Section 9. Moses' Egyptian identity, education, and linguistic formation. Section 10. Israel's 430 years in Egypt. Hebrew cannot be assumed as the original medium. Section 11. Cumulative argument, the weight of converging evidence. Section 12. Rebuttal, answering the strongest counterarguments. Section 13. Conclusion, toward a theology of the unnamed and unhidden. Works consulted. Section 1. The problem of Lord in your Bible, manuscripts, translators, and the word you are actually reading. When a reader opens an English Bible and encounters the word Lord, rendered customarily in small capital letters, in passages such as Exodus 3:15, Deuteronomy 6:4, or Psalm 23:1, a natural and understandable assumption arises that this is the Creator's own name, faithfully preserved and faithfully transmitted across millennia. That assumption, however, is mistaken in ways that are both historically demonstrable and theologically consequential. The reader is not reading the Creator's own name. The reader is reading a translator's decision, made on their behalf, often without their awareness, the end result of a chain of human choices, scribal, oral, editorial, and linguistic, that stretches across more than 2,000 years. Understanding this chain is not merely an academic exercise, It is the foundational prerequisite for evaluating every claim made about the Tetragrammaton's status as the divine name. The major English Bible translations, among them the King James Version (KJV), the New International Version (NIV), the English Standard Version (ESV), and the New American Standard Bible (NASB), all follow a shared convention. Wherever the Hebrew Tetragrammaton (YHWH), the four consonants YHWH, appears in the manuscript tradition from which they are translating, they render it as Lord in small capitals. This rendering is not a translation in any strict linguistic sense. Lord is not the English meaning of YHWH. Scholars do not know with certainty what YHWH means. Its etymology remains disputed, with proposals ranging from a causative form of the verb to be, meaning he causes to be or he who brings into existence, to a shortened liturgical form of an older divine name. What Lord represents, therefore, is a substitution. A decision to make visible in printed English a vocal tradition that had already replaced the name before the ink reached the page. That vocal tradition derives from Jewish scribal and liturgical practice developed over many centuries before the Common Era. Jewish readers, out of profound reverence for the divine name, had adopted the practice of substituting the spoken word Adonai, meaning Lord or Master, whenever the Tetragrammaton was encountered in the text. The reader's eyes would see the four Hebrew consonants YHWH, but the reader's mouth would say Adonai. This substitution was not written into the text. It was an oral convention maintained by communal tradition. When Christian translators in the medieval and early modern periods turned to the Hebrew manuscripts, they encountered this same convention and made the decision to render it visibly. The Tetragrammaton in the text became Lord on the printed page, making the oral substitution a typographical reality. The English-speaking reader thus inherits a tradition of substitution that was already one layer removed from any original utterance before translation even began. To understand the full depth of the problem, one must grasp the distinction between the two primary manuscript traditions that undergird the Christian Old Testament. The first is the Masoretic text, MT, the Hebrew manuscript tradition preserved by the Masoretes, a succession of Jewish scribes who codified and standardized the Hebrew scriptures between approximately the 6th and 10th centuries CE. The Masoretic text is the basis for most Protestant Old Testaments and is the source from which the small capitals Lord convention is derived. The second tradition is the Septuagint, LXX, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, begun approximately 250 BCE in Alexandria, Egypt. The Septuagint was the Bible of the early church, the version predominantly used and quoted by the apostles, and the version from which Christos himself drew the majority of his scriptural citations. These two traditions are not identical, they diverge in meaningful ways, and their divergence is directly relevant to the question of the divine name. In the Masoretic text, the Tetragrammaton appears approximately 6,828 times across the Hebrew Bible. This is the source of the frequently cited 800+ occurrences argument advanced by advocates of the Tetragrammaton's centrality and authenticity. In the Septuagint, however, those same locations overwhelmingly contain not the Tetragrammaton but the Greek word Kyrios, meaning Lord, Master, or Ruler. The vast majority of surviving Septuagint manuscripts do not contain the Hebrew letters or any Hebrew equivalent at those points in the text. Some early manuscript fragments complicate this picture in important ways. The Nahal Hever Greek Minor Prophet Scroll, dated approximately 50 BCE to 50 CE, shows the Tetragrammaton written in Paleo-Hebrew script within a Greek text, suggesting that at least some early Greek manuscripts of the scriptures preserved the Hebrew letters in an archaic script. This discovery indicates that the systematic Kyrios substitution visible in later LXX manuscripts may have been a subsequent editorial development, yet it simultaneously reinforces the central argument. Even within the Greek manuscript tradition, scribes were making deliberate choices about how to handle the divine name, choices that varied by community, time period, and theological conviction. The implication of this divergence between manuscript traditions is direct and critical. The argument that the Tetragrammaton appears 6,828 times in the scriptures is circular and manuscript dependent. It appears 6,828 times in the Masoretic tradition because Masoretic scribes, a community that had committed, as a matter of theological conviction, to the Tetragrammaton as the divine name, chose to write it in those 6,828 locations. When one turns to the Septuagint tradition, the tradition employed by Christos and the apostles, those same locations yield Kyrios, not the Tetragrammaton. The name does not appear 6,828 times in the oldest, most broadly used manuscript tradition of the scriptural community that would become Christianity. It appears in one scribal tradition, as the choice of that tradition's scribes, reflecting that tradition's theological commitments. The problem is further compounded by the internal history of the Masoretic text itself. The consonantal text of the Hebrew Bible predates the Masoretes, but it was the Masoretes who added the system of vowel points, called Nikodot, that told readers how to pronounce those consonants. These vowel points were added between the 7th and 10th centuries c. more than a millennium after the events described in Exodus. When the Masoretes came to the Tetragrammaton, they faced the inherited tradition that its pronunciation was not to be spoken aloud. Accordingly, they added not the Tetragrammaton's own vowels but the vowels of Adonai, or in certain contexts Elohim, as a reading prompt to remind the reader to say the substitute word. A medieval Christian scholar, misreading this convention as straightforward vocalization, produced the hybrid form Jehovah, combining the consonants of YHWH with the vowels of Adonai, a form that has no attestation in any ancient source whatsoever. Jehovah is, in the most literal sense, a word that was never spoken by anyone in the ancient world in any language. The cumulative picture is therefore this. When a reader of any English Bible reads the word Lord in an Old Testament passage, they are reading the product of a chain of human decisions that includes, at minimum, the following links. First, a scribal choice to use the Tetragrammaton in one particular manuscript tradition. Second, a communal oral substitution tradition that replaced its pronunciation with Adonai. Third, a Masoretic editorial decision to add the vowels of Adonai to the consonants of the Tetragrammaton. Fourth, a translator's decision to make that oral substitution visible as the printed word Lord. And fifth, in many traditions, the centuries-long influence of a hybrid form, Jehovah, with zero ancient attestation. At no point in this chain does the creator's own voice appear. What appears at every link is a human decision, reverent, carefully considered, often well-intentioned but human nonetheless. This foundational reality must govern all that follows in this paper. Every subsequent argument rests upon it, and every subsequent citation of the Lord, in biblical texts must be read through this lens of accumulated human mediation. Section 2. The late compilation of Exodus, a text built by editors, not a single voice. The book of Exodus, as it exists in the canonical Hebrew Bible, is not the product of a single author writing from a single perspective at a single moment in history. The scholarly consensus established over more than a century of rigorous textual analysis holds that the Pentateuch, including Exodus, is a composite text assembled from multiple source traditions over an extended period, reaching something approaching its present form no earlier than the 6th or 5th century BCE. Wellhausen, 1878. Friedman, 1987. The documentary hypothesis, refined through successive generations of scholarship, identifies at least 4 primary source traditions woven together in the Pentateuch. The Jahwist, J, characterized by its use of YHWH from the beginning of human history. The Elohist, E, characterized by its preference for the divine title Elohim, and its narrative of YHWH's name being newly revealed to Moses. The priestly source, P, which offers the most theologically developed and formally structured material, and the Deuteronomist, D, whose signature appears most prominently in Deuteronomy. The name revelation passages central to the Tetragrammaton argument, primarily Exodus 3 and Exodus 6, are attributed to the Elohist and priestly sources respectively, meaning that what reads as a single coherent narrative in the English Bible is in fact the editorial weaving together of at least 2 originally independent accounts of the same event, composed by different communities at different times for different theological purposes. The narrative structure of Exodus itself signals this composite character to any careful reader. Throughout the book, a narrator's voice stands between the reader and the events described. The Lord said to Moses, Moses told the people, and Moses did as the Lord commanded. This third-person narration is not eyewitness testimony. It is the voice of an editor, or multiple editors, at a temporal distance from the events, mediating rather than testifying. The reader never hears the creator's voice directly. The reader hears the narrator's report of what the creator said, filtered through whatever sources the narrator was assembling, preserved in whatever scribal form those sources had taken, and transmitted through whatever manuscript tradition later carried the text forward. This is not a minor procedural point. It is a structural reality that governs the entire text. The anachronisms embedded in Exodus reinforce the conclusion of late composition. Exodus 1 verse 11 identifies the cities that the enslaved Israelites built as Pithom and Ramesses. The city of Ramesses Pyrames was founded by Ramesses II in the 13th century BCE and critically fell into disuse and was largely dismantled by the late New Kingdom period, with its stones repurposed for other construction projects. The name Ramesses as a toponym would have been most culturally recognizable to an audience of the later monarchic or post-monarchic period, when such names circulated in literary and historical memory, rather than lived geographic reality. The presence of such nomenclature within Exodus suggests that at least portions of the text were composed or edited by authors writing from a temporal distance, authors for whom Ramesses was a remembered name rather than a contemporary address. Most decisively for the present argument, the text of Exodus itself explicitly acknowledges a discontinuity in the divine name tradition. Exodus 6 verses 2 and 3 records, God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am YHWH. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name YHWH I did not make myself known to them. This passage is a remarkable internal confession embedded within the text. The Creator is depicted as acknowledging that the name YHWH was not the name by which the patriarchs knew him. It was, by the text's own admission, a newly revealed name, introduced in the Mosaic tradition, not an eternal, primordial, universal designation that had obtained from the foundation of existence. This confession undermines any claim that the Tetragrammaton represents the Creator's original, self-given name. The text itself identifies it as a name specific to the Mosaic revelatory moment. And when one applies the manuscript insight from section 1, that every English Bible's Lord in Exodus is a translator's convention applied to a Masoretic scribal choice applied to an editorial construction, one understands that the name appearing in Exodus 3 arrives before the English reader after passing through editorial construction, scribal preservation, Masoretic standardization, and translator convention, for layers of human mediation, none of which can be mistaken for the Creator's unmediated voice. Section 3. Deuteronomy's first-person authority, what Moses actually emphasized. If one is seeking the closest available approximation of Moses' own voice in the canonical scriptures, the natural place to look is Deuteronomy. The book opens with an unambiguous declaration of first-person Mosaic speech. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan, Deuteronomy 1 verse 1. Unlike the third-person narration of Exodus, in which an editorial voice reports what Moses said and did, Deuteronomy presents itself as Moses' own sustained address to the people of Israel. Even accounting for the scholarly consensus that Deuteronomy's current form reflects the work of a Deuteronomist school, DTR, active in the late monarchic and exilic periods, the tradition that Deuteronomy represents Mosaic teaching is foundational to its canonical authority. It is, therefore, instructive to ask, when Moses speaks in his own voice, what does he emphasize about the Creator? The answer, across Deuteronomy's 34 chapters, is consistent and striking. Moses' sustained emphasis is on covenant faithfulness, divine character, the commandments, and the relational obligations of the people toward their God. He speaks of the Creator's steadfast love, his jealousy for exclusive loyalty, his justice, his power, his acts and history. He frames the divine identity in terms of deeds and character. He does not deliver lectures on the correct phonetic pronunciation of the divine name, nor does he frame the covenant relationship in terms of name invocation. The name functions in Deuteronomy as a covenant historical identity marker, YHWH your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, not as a phonetic formula requiring precise utterance. Most revealing in this regard is Deuteronomy 4 verse 15, where Moses himself declares, "Watch yourselves very carefully, so that you do not become corrupt and make for yourselves an idol, an image of any shape, for you saw no form of any kind the day which I spoke to you at Horeb out of the fire." The emphasis Moses places is on hiddenness and formlessness. What the people encountered at Horeb, Moses says, was a voice without a visible form, an encounter with a presence that refused to be pinned down in image or shape. The theological point Moses foregrounds is not phonetic specificity but ontological transcendence. The Creator, as Moses presents him, is precisely the being who exceeds all human attempts at fixed designation, whether in image or in name. This resonates powerfully with the argument developed throughout this paper. The manuscript point established in Section 1 must again be integrated here, because it directly affects how Deuteronomy can be used as evidence. Every instance of Lord in Deuteronomy in an English Bible is a translator's convention applied to what Masoretic scribes wrote. Moses never spoke the English word Lord to Israel. Moses spoke in whatever language or languages he employed, and what he said passed through oral tradition, then into scribal encoding, then through Masoretic standardization, then through translation into English. At each stage, human choices were made. The chain from Moses' original mouth to the English reader's eye is so long and so thoroughly mediated by human editorial decisions that, the Lord said, in Deuteronomy cannot function as unambiguous testimony to Moses' endorsement of any particular phonetic name. What Moses emphasized, character, covenant, hiddenness, and faithfulness, endures through the mediation. What the text cannot reliably deliver is the precise phonetic form of whatever name, if any, Moses used in his original speech. Section 4. Ehyeh Ehyeh, a verbal dynamic, not a proper name, and the editorial transformation into YHWH. The moment most frequently cited as the definitive divine name revelation in the Hebrew Scriptures occurs in Exodus 3 verse 14. Moses at the burning bush asks the deity whose voice comes from the fire, "If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name? What shall I say to them?'" The response delivered in verse 14 is, Ehyeh Ehyeh, typically rendered in English Bibles as, "I am that I am," or "I am who I am." What is often missed in popular engagement with this passage, but what any competent Hebraist immediately recognizes, is that Ehyeh is not a proper noun. It is the first person singular imperfect of the Hebrew verb Ehyeh, meaning to be. The form is verbal, dynamic, and open-ended. I am what I am who I am, or equally valid in the imperfect aspect, I will be what I will be. The Creator's self-identification as delivered in Exodus 3 verse 14 is not a name in the phonetic sense. It is a verbal declaration of ontological sovereignty, a refusal to be defined by any fixed designation. The Tetragrammaton YHWH presents itself in Exodus 3 verse 15, one verse later, as the name by which the Creator is to be known across generations. But the grammatical relationship between Ehyeh and YHWH is precisely the gap through which the editorial transformation operates. YHWH is the third-person singular imperfect of the same verb Ehyeh. He is, or in the causative form, he who causes to be. Ehyeh is first person, YHWH is third person. In other words, the Creator, speaking of himself, uses Ehyeh, I am. The narrator and scribal community, speaking about the Creator, use YHWH, he is. The name that the Creator gave in Exodus 3 verse 14, if the text is to be trusted on its own terms, is not YHWH, it is Ehyeh. YHWH is what the narrator and scribal community called him. An editorial transformation from the Creator's own first-person verbal dynamic into a third-person referential designation coined by those who speak about him rather than as him. This distinction, elementary in form but profound in implication, means that the Tetragrammaton is not the Creator's self-name but his scribal name, the name given to him by those who wrote about him. This point becomes even more significant when read against the backdrop of the manuscript traditions discussed in Section 1. Whether one consults the Masoretic text or the Septuagint, what one encounters at Exodus 3 verse 15 is either the Tetragrammaton MT or Kyrios LXX. Both are designations applied to the divine by scribal or translational communities, not by the Creator's own mouth in that passage. The Creator's own utterance, as Exodus 3 verse 14 presents it, is Ehyeh, and no major tradition advocates for Ehyeh as the universal, eternal divine name to be invoked by believers. Yet if the text is read consistently, Ehyeh has a stronger textual claim to being the Creator's own first-person self-designation than YHWH. The Masoretic scribes then added to this complexity by applying vowel points to YHWH that did not reflect its original pronunciation but rather prompted the reader to say Adonai, producing the eventual Christian hybrid Jehovah, a form utterly without precedent in any ancient source. The Tetragrammaton's journey from Exodus 3 verse 15 to the English Reader's Bible is a journey of continuous scribal transformation, none of which can be mistaken for the unmodified voice of the Creator. Section 5. The 6828 occurrences argument, why frequency is not evidence of origin. Among the arguments most frequently marshaled in defense of the Tetragrammaton's status as the authentic divine name is the argument from frequency. The Tetragrammaton appears approximately 6,828 times in the Hebrew Bible, as preserved in the Masoretic text, making it the most frequently occurring divine designation in the canonical scriptures. The implicit and sometimes explicit reasoning is that such overwhelming frequency constitutes proof of centrality, authenticity, and perhaps primordial origin. The Creator's name is there 6,828 times, too consistent and too pervasive to be an error or an imposition. This argument, while rhetorically powerful, is formally invalid. Its invalidity lies in a logical structure that is precisely circular, and the circularity becomes apparent the moment one presses on the question of which manuscript tradition is providing the count. The 6,828 figure derives entirely from the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is a manuscript tradition preserved and codified by Jewish scribal communities whose primary theological commitment was, by definition, to the Tetragrammaton as the divine name. These communities had inherited and maintained the scribal tradition that treated YHWH as the established divine designation. Their work of standardization, vowel pointing, and textual preservation was carried out in service of that tradition. To count the occurrences of the Tetragrammaton in their manuscripts, and then use that count as proof that the Tetragrammaton is the true divine name is to count the conclusions of people who already believe the conclusion. The formal structure of the argument is, YHWH must be the true name because it appears 6,828 times in the Masoretic text. But the reason it appears 6,828 times in the Masoretic text is precisely that the Masoretes and their predecessors believed it was the true name and therefore wrote it consistently throughout the corpus they were preserving. The frequency of a scribal choice cannot validate the theological conviction behind that choice without collapsing into circularity. A direct comparison with the Septuagint tradition exposes this circularity with particular clarity. In the Greek Septuagint, the manuscript tradition that functioned as the authoritative scriptures for the early church, the apostles, and Christos himself, those same 6,828 locations in the text overwhelmingly contain not YHWH but Kyrios. If frequency of appearance across a large scriptural corpus were the criterion for establishing authenticity, then Kyrios appears in those same passages just as systematically and consistently as YHWH does in the Masoretic tradition. Yet no serious theological tradition argues that Kyrios is the Creator's eternal, original, primordial name. The Septuagint comparison thus reveals the frequency argument's dependence on presupposing the very manuscript tradition, whose authority is under examination. The evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls further complicates the picture in ways that simultaneously demonstrate scribal reverence for the name and expose its treatment as a matter of ongoing scribal convention, rather than received universal standard. Some Qumran manuscripts write the Tetragrammaton in ancient Paleo-Hebrew script, a deliberately archaic alphabetic form, within texts otherwise written in the standard square Aramaic script. This practice demonstrates that scribes of the Qumran community regarded the Tetragrammaton as requiring special treatment, different enough from the surrounding text to warrant a script change. That reverence is historically significant and should be acknowledged, but it simultaneously demonstrates that how the name was to be written was itself a matter of deliberate scribal choice and community convention. Not all Hebrew writing communities in the Second Temple period wrote the Tetragrammaton in the same way, undermining any claim of an unbroken, primordial, universally consistent scribal standard. Furthermore, even within the Masoretic corpus itself, the frequency of the Tetragrammaton varies considerably across different books, reflecting the theological emphases and source traditions of different editorial communities. The Jahwist J source uses YHWH habitually from the beginning of the Genesis narrative. The Elohist I source prefers Elohim and reserves YHWH for the post-Mosaic period. The priestly P source makes the explicit claim of Exodus 6 verses 2 and 3 that YHWH was newly revealed to Moses. These internal variations in usage reflect the editorial and theological differences of the source communities, not a single unbroken divine mandate operative across the whole corpus. The high frequency of the Tetragrammaton in J source material reflects J's theological conviction, not independent corroboration of YHWH's universal primordial status. The conclusion is inescapable. The 6,828 occurrences of the Tetragrammaton in the Masoretic text prove, with certainty, that Masoretic scribes and their predecessors used the Tetragrammaton 6,828 times. They prove nothing whatsoever about whether that designation is the Creator's eternal, original, universal, and self-given name. Frequency of use within a committed tradition is evidence of the tradition's commitment. It is not and cannot be evidence of the ultimate validity of the belief that motivates that commitment. Section 6. Christos and the Divine Name, the silence that speaks. The evidence from the life and teachings of Christos constitutes one of the most significant, and most frequently overlooked, dimensions of the divine name question. In all four canonical Gospels, Christos does not once use the Tetragrammaton. He does not invoke it, does not teach his disciples to invoke it, does not correct anyone's pronunciation of it, and does not frame his proclamation of the Creator's identity around it. His consistent and characteristic mode of address for the Creator is Father, in the Aramaic Abba, and in the Greek Pater, a relational designation that carries no resemblance to the four Hebrew consonants YHWH. This is not a peripheral observation. It is a datum about the teaching practice of the figure, whom the entirety of New Testament theology regards as the supreme revealer of the Creator's identity and will. The silence of Christos regarding the Tetragrammaton is not an argument from absence in any trivial sense. It is an argument from the character of his teaching as a whole. The Gospels were composed in Greek, the lingua franca of the Mediterranean world in the 1st century CE. If Christos employed the Tetragrammaton in his original Aramaic or Hebrew speech, the Gospel authors made the deliberate choice not to preserve or transmit it. This is itself a significant editorial decision. The most natural explanation, consistent with everything else we know about the scriptural environment in which Christos taught, is that Christos operated within the Septuagint tradition, the tradition in which Kyrios, not YHWH, appeared in the divine designation locations. Christos quoted extensively from the Hebrew scriptures, and the scholarly consensus is that his quotations overwhelmingly align with the Septuagint rather than the Hebrew text underlying the Masoretic tradition. Tove 2012. In endorsing the LXX by his quotation practice, Christos endorsed the tradition in which Kyrios, not the Tetragrammaton, occupied the locations where the divine name appeared. He never, so far as any surviving evidence indicates, corrected his Greek-speaking audience or his Greek-writing evangelists by insisting on the Tetragrammaton. The Lord's Prayer, the model prayer that Christos delivered in response to a direct request from his disciples for instruction on prayer, treats the name of the Creator with a particular theological posture. Hallowed be thy name, Matthew 6 verse 9. The name is to be hallowed, set apart, revered. It is not invoked, it is not spelled out, it is not identified. The structure of the prayer positions the name as the object of reverence and sanctification, not as a phonetic formula to be pronounced. This posture is entirely consistent with the argument advanced throughout this paper. The Creator's name is not a formula for invocation but a reality to be approached with humility and awe. John 17 verse 6 presents what many regard as Christos' own declaration of divine name revelation. I have revealed your name to those whom you gave me out of the world. Standard advocates of Tetragrammaton theology read this as evidence that Christos revealed YHWH, but this reading collapses upon examination of the Greek term, onoma, name, and its Hebrew counterpart, shem. In both the Greek and Hebrew semantic worlds of the biblical period, the name of a person or deity carried a meaning far richer than phonetic label. The name meant character, nature, reputation, and essence. When Christos declares in John 17 that he has revealed the Creator's name, what follows in the prayer is a revelation of character, unity, love, divine indwelling, and relational communion between the Creator and humanity. No phonetic designation is offered. The name that Christos revealed by the text's own internal evidence is Father, the relational identity that he made known to his disciples, a relational identity wholly absent from the four consonants YHWH. This is the name revelation of John 17. Not a phonetic sequence but a relational reality. Even for those who read the text through which Christos quoted, the manuscript picture established in section 1 applies with full force. The Old Testament texts that Christos cited were known to his Greek-speaking audience through the Septuagint, in which Kyrios replaced the Tetragrammaton. The divine name tradition that the earliest Messianic community inhabited was a Kyrios tradition, not a YHWH tradition. The Tetragrammaton's claim to be the name endorsed by Christos rests entirely on inserting it back into passages where Christos' own quotation tradition shows Kyrios, an interpolation without textual warrant. Section 7. Hosea 2 verse 16, the prophetic rejection of Lord title theology. Among the prophetic texts of the Hebrew Bible, Hosea 2 verse 16 stands as one of the most theologically pointed and, for the present argument, one of the most consequential. The verse records a divine declaration addressed to Israel. In that day, declares YHWH, you will call me Ehyeh, my husband, and no longer will you call me Bali, my Lord/Master. The immediate context is the prophet Hosea's extended metaphor of Israel's covenant relationship with the Creator as a marriage, with Israel's pursuit of other gods cast as marital infidelity. In the eschatological vision of restoration, the Creator promises a return to intimacy, and the terms of that restored intimacy are specifically defined by a repudiation of one title category in favor of another. This passage, when read with precision, carries implications that extend far beyond the question of Canaanite Baal worship. The key to the passage's broader significance lies in the semantic analysis of the two contrasted titles. Bali derives from the Hebrew root Baal, meaning Lord, Master, or Owner, the same root that names the Canaanite deity Baal. Ehyeh derives from Ish, meaning man or husband. The contrast the text establishes is between a relationship defined by lordship and ownership, and a relationship defined by intimate spousal union. The Creator is repudiating not merely one particular deity named Baal, but the entire semantic category of Lord/Master/Owner, as an appropriate designator for the divine-human relationship. This semantic critique is of the gravest consequence when set alongside the other divine designation traditions under examination in this paper. Adonai, the Jewish community's substitute pronunciation for the Tetragrammaton, used orally whenever YHWH appeared in the text, means in Hebrew, Lord, Master, or Sovereign. It occupies precisely the same semantic field as Baal. The Greek Kyrios, the Septuagint's standard rendering in the locations of the Tetragrammaton, and the New Testament's most frequent divine designation, means Lord, Master, or Ruler. It too occupies that same semantic field. If Hosea 2 verse 16 records the Creator repudiating the Lord/Master title category as an appropriate form of address, then all three of the major substitute traditions simultaneously fall under the scope of that prophetic critique. Baal, Adonai, and Kyrios are, by the very terms of Hosea's contrast, part of the category being rejected in favor of intimate spousal address. The passage does not name Adonai or Kyrios, but it names the semantic category to which they both belong, and in doing so, it subjects the entire tradition of Lord title substitution to prophetic scrutiny. Hosea 2 verse 17 compounds the force of this critique. God declares that He will remove the names of the Baals from Israel's mouth, so that they will be remembered no more. If the semantic category of Lord/Master is what is to be removed, rather than merely one proper name within that category, then the scope of removal is broader than any single deity. The prophetic vision of restoration is a vision of address that transcends the Lord/Master paradigm entirely, moving toward the intimacy of my husband. This is, in itself, a profound theological statement about the nature of the Creator's desired relationship with humanity. Not hierarchical domination but intimate partnership. The manuscript irony embedded in this passage deserves specific attention, because it illustrates precisely the problem that Section 1 identified. When an English reader opens their Bible and reads Hosea 2 verse 16, they encounter the phrase declares the Lord, where Lord is the translator's convention for the Masoretic Tetragrammaton, which in the oral tradition was pronounced Adonai, and which in the Septuagint became Kyrios. In the very verse where the Creator is depicted as rejecting the Lord/Master title category, the translator has placed a Lord title in the mouth of that declaration, because the translation convention requires it. The Creator says through Hosea's text, "Do not call me Bali my Lord," and the translator's frame reads, "declares the Lord." This is not a theological error on the Creator's part. It is an irony produced by the translation convention, an irony that makes visible, in a single verse, the entire problem of using scribal and translational Lord titles as divine names. Section 8. Ammonius, the Hidden One and the Ontology of the Divine Name in Egypt. Egyptian theology at its most developed articulated a concept of the divine name that resonates, in ways that are historically grounded rather than merely metaphorical, with what the burning bush narrative enacts. The deity Ammonius, whose name derives from the Egyptian root, meaning to conceal, or to be hidden, was identified by Egyptian theological tradition as the Hidden One, Assman, 2001. The pyramid texts, among the oldest religious writings in human history dating to approximately 2350 BCE, contain early references to this concept of hiddenness as a primary divine attribute. By the New Kingdom period, roughly 1550–1070 BCE, Ammonius had ascended to become the preeminent deity of the Egyptian pantheon, the Hidden One who was simultaneously all things, whose name was concealed precisely because no finite designation could contain the fullness of what he was. The Egyptian theological formula associated with Ammonius' hidden nature is particularly instructive. Hidden is his name as Ammonius, a formulation in which the hiddenness of the divine name is itself the primary ontological statement about the deity. In Egyptian theological thought, the true name of a deity was its innermost essence. To know a deity's true name was to possess power over it. Accordingly, the greatest and most transcendent deities were those whose true names were most thoroughly hidden. The hidden name was not an absence or a deficiency. It was the supreme expression of divine transcendence. A deity fully and permanently capturable by a phonetic designation was, in the Egyptian conceptual world, a lesser deity, one whose essence could be bounded by human language. This Egyptian theological architecture maps with striking precision onto what the burning bush encounter itself performs. The creator, when directly asked for his name, does not give a fixed phonetic answer. He gives a verbal dynamic, Ehyeh asher Ehyeh, a statement of ontological sovereignty that resists reduction to a proper noun. The encounter is with a fire that burns without consuming, a visual image of presence that transcends normal categories of material reality. Deuteronomy 4 verse 15, as Moses himself underscores, establishes that the people saw no form of any kind at Horeb. Hiddenness and formlessness are the Creator's own chosen modes of self-presentation in the foundational revelatory encounter. These are not incidentally parallel to Ammonius theology, they are conceptually identical, and the historical connection is not one that needs to be established by theological speculation but by biographical fact. Moses, as Acts 7 verse 22 canonically declares, was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. He was raised from infancy in the household of Pharaoh, in an intellectual and theological environment saturated with Egyptian cosmology, priestly learning, and the developed theological reflection of one of the world's great ancient civilizations. Smith, 2001. The concept of the hidden divine name was not a foreign idea he might have encountered on the margins. It was part of the foundational intellectual formation of anyone educated in Egyptian wisdom to the depth that Acts describes. When Moses encountered the deity who spoke from the fire and declined to give a static name, Moses would not have been epistemologically unprepared for such a response. He would have recognized, at least intuitively, the ontological logic. The transcendent creator cannot be captured by a finite phonetic designation, and the refusal to be so captured is itself a declaration of transcendence. The hidden name of Egyptian ontology illuminates rather than contradicts the burning bush encounter. It supplies the conceptual framework within which Moses would have understood the encounter he was having. Section 9. Moses' Egyptian identity, education, and linguistic formation. The biblical tradition is consistent and specific about Moses' origins and formation. He was born to Israelite parents, placed in a basket on the Nile, discovered by Pharaoh's daughter, and raised within Pharaoh's household from infancy. Exodus 2 verse 10. His very name, Moses in Hebrew Moshe, is itself Egyptian in origin. The Egyptian root MSY, or Mos/Mezu, means born of or son of, and appears in the names of Egyptian royalty throughout the New Kingdom period. Thutmose, born of Thoth; Amos, born of the moon; Ramesses, born of Ra. Moses' name by the Egyptian pattern may represent a truncated theophoric name, born of deity, with the divine element omitted or lost in the Israelite transmission of the story. Whatever the precise etymology, the name's Egyptian character is not in dispute among scholars of the ancient Near East. Moses' name announces his cultural formation before his biography does. Acts 7 verse 22 declares explicitly that Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was powerful in his words and deeds. This canonical statement assigns to Moses a comprehensive Egyptian education, not merely familiarity with Egyptian customs, but mastery of Egyptian learning at the level accessible to someone raised in the royal household. Egyptian education in the New Kingdom period was sophisticated and extensive. It included language, hieratic script for administrative and literary purposes, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, law, theology, and priestly lore. A child educated at Pharaoh's court would have been immersed in the full intellectual tradition of one of the ancient world's most developed civilizations, including its theological frameworks for understanding the divine. Assman, 2001. Moses' primary linguistic formation was therefore Egyptian. Hebrew, or more precisely, whatever Proto-Semitic language the Israelites spoke in the pre-Mosaic period, was not the language of Moses' education, his administrative formation, or his theological vocabulary. The question of what language Moses habitually thought in, wrote in, and spoke in when addressing the courts of power is answered by his biography, Egyptian. This creates an immediate and significant complication for claims that the Tetragrammaton was revealed to Moses in pure, unmediated Hebrew, because Moses was not, in any straightforward sense, a native Hebrew speaker or thinker. His conceptual vocabulary was Egyptian. Exodus 4 verse 10 adds a specific biographical detail that scholarly tradition has long found significant. Moses protests to the deity at the burning bush, "I am heavy of mouth and heavy of tongue." This phrase has been interpreted by scholars in several ways, but one well-attested reading is that Moses was experiencing language attrition, difficulty with Hebrew after a lifetime of Egyptian linguistic formation. Schneidwind, 2013. After decades in Pharaoh's court speaking Egyptian, and then a further period in Midian, Moses' facility with the Hebrew or Proto-Semitic language of his biological family had diminished. If Moses struggled with Hebrew if his primary linguistic formation was Egyptian, then the assumption that the Creator would reveal a Hebrew name to Moses in Hebrew and have Moses transmitted in Hebrew, across all the mediating layers of oral tradition and scribal encoding, is an assumption that rests on a biography it cannot support. The Kenite-Midianite hypothesis, advanced by Cross, 1973, and building on earlier work by Albright, 1968, and others, provides an additional complication. This hypothesis proposes that YHWH was originally a tribal theonym, a deity name among Kenite or Midianite peoples, and that Moses encountered it through his association with Jethro, his father-in-law and a priest of Midian. If this hypothesis is correct, and the evidence from Judges 1 verse 16, Judges 4 verse 11, and Habakkuk 3 verse 3, which locates YHWH's origin in the region of Taman, Paran Sinai not Canaan, lends it significant support, then YHWH entered Israelite religious tradition as a regional theonym borrowed through Moses' Midianite connections, not as a primordial creator name revealed from eternity. Even if Moses received something in Midian, what he originally received, what oral tradition transformed in transmission, what scribes encoded as the Tetragrammaton, and what translators rendered as Lord constitutes four distinct and compounding layers of human mediation, none of which can be identified with certainty as the Creator's own unmediated voice. Section 10. Israel's 430 years in Egypt. Hebrew cannot be assumed as the original medium. Exodus 12 verse 40 establishes the duration of Israel's sojourn in Egypt. The time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. The Septuagint and Samaritan Pentateuch versions of this verse distribute the 430 years between Egypt and Canaan, suggesting that the total period of sojourning spans both regions. Even on the most conservative reading of the variant traditions, a multi-generational, deeply immersive experience of Egyptian culture is undeniable. 430 years is not a brief encounter with a foreign civilization. It is approximately 17 to 20 generations of sustained, daily, comprehensive cultural immersion. The implications of this duration for questions of linguistic and cultural identity are enormous, and have been significantly underappreciated in discussions of the Tetragrammaton. The comparison with other documented periods of linguistic transformation in the biblical narrative is instructive. The Babylonian captivity lasted approximately 70 years, a period of roughly 3 generations. Yet the effects of that relatively brief encounter with Aramaic culture were so profound that large portions of the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Daniel are written in Aramaic, rather than Hebrew. Aramaic loanwords penetrated deeply into post-exilic Hebrew, and Aramaic became the dominant spoken language of Jewish communities throughout the Near East for centuries afterward. If 70 years of Babylonian immersion produced this degree of linguistic penetration and cultural transformation, then 430 years of Egyptian immersion, more than 6 times as long, would have produced linguistic and cultural effects of an entirely different order of magnitude. The linguistic consequence for the present argument is direct. Children born in Egypt to Israelite parents would have grown up surrounded by Egyptian as the language of power, commerce, administration, social survival, and cultural prestige. Survival in Egypt, especially for a population occupying the social position the Exodus narrative describes, required Egyptian fluency. Parents might speak a Semitic home language, but the dominant cultural language of the children's formation would have been Egyptian. Over 14 to 20 generations of this dynamic Proto-Hebrew would have undergone attrition, creolization, and massive Egyptian vocabulary and syntax absorption. What returned from Egypt with the Exodus generation, if the Exodus narrative reflects any historical reality, was a linguistic community whose deepest intuitions, whose primary conceptual vocabulary, and whose emotional register were formed by Egyptian rather than Semitic linguistic structures. Original Hebrew as an uncorrupted, uncontaminated, pristine linguistic medium for eternal divine revelation is, in light of this historical reality, not merely implausible but historically untenable. Schneidwind, 2013. Even if a divine name was revealed at Sinai or Horeb, even if the burning bush encounter reflects a historical event, the people who received it were people whose linguistic formation was Egyptian. The name, whatever it was in the moment of its utterance, was received by Egyptian-formed ears, processed through Egyptian-shaped cognition, transmitted through a community in the process of linguistic reconstruction, later encoded in what became Proto-Hebrew script, subsequently standardized by Masoretic scribes in the Common Era, and finally rendered in English as Lord. The chain of transformations from the original revelatory moment, if such a moment occurred, to the English reader's Bible is so long, so linguistically complex, and so thoroughly mediated by human choices at every stage, that the claim of phonetic fidelity to an eternal original cannot be sustained. What the Tetragrammaton preserves at best is a scribal tradition's best effort to encode a name whose original form, original context, and original linguistic medium are all, in the most rigorous historical sense, unknown. Section 11. Cumulative argument, the weight of converging evidence. No single argument advanced in this paper requires in isolation to be definitive. The case for the Tetragrammaton's status as the Creator's original revealed name is not dismantled by any one pillar failing. Rather, it is undermined by the convergence of 10 distinct lines of evidence, each of which compounds and reinforces the others, producing a cumulative weight of evidentiary pressure that the standard defenses of the Tetragrammaton cannot bear simultaneously. The strength of the cumulative argument lies precisely in its multidisciplinary breadth. It is simultaneously a textual argument, a manuscript argument, a linguistic argument, a historical argument, a theological argument, and a philosophical argument. No single counterargument can address all of these dimensions at once. The argument begins with the editorial nature of Exodus itself. The text that narrates the divine name revelation in Exodus 3 and Exodus 6 is not a single eyewitness account but a composite text assembled from at least two originally independent source traditions, Elohist and priestly, compiled by editors over a period of centuries, and presenting a third-person narrator's reconstruction of events rather than first-person testimony. The name that arrives through Exodus arrives through editorial layers, not through an unmediated divine declaration. Exodus 6 verses 2 and 3 itself confesses that the name was newly introduced in the Mosaic period, not primordially established. The first-person Mosaic testimony of Deuteronomy, which stands closest to Moses' own voice in the canonical corpus, foregrounds hiddenness, covenant, and character rather than phonetic name specificity. Moses' own emphasis, "You saw no form of any kind," points consistently toward the transcendence of all fixed designation. Moses' Egyptian formation and his documented difficulty with Hebrew, Exodus 4 verse 10, render the assumption that he received and transmitted a pure Hebrew phonetic name historically problematic. Israel's 430 years of Egyptian immersion makes the claim of an uncontaminated Hebrew medium for that transmission historically untenable. Schneidwind, 2013. At the heart of the burning bush narrative itself, the Creator's own utterance in Exodus 3 verse 14 is not the Tetragrammaton but Ehyeh, a first-person verbal dynamic that resists reduction to a proper noun. The Tetragrammaton is the scribal community's third-person editorial derivation from that verbal dynamic, not the Creator's own self-designation. The 6,828 occurrences of the Tetragrammaton in the Masoretic text reflect the scribal community's commitment to that designation, not primordial divine origin. The same locations in the Septuagint consistently yield Kyrios, demonstrating that frequency within one tradition cannot establish cross-traditional validity. The manuscript reality of section 1 runs through every other section as the thread that binds them. Lord in every English Bible is a translator's convention for a scribe's convention for an oral substitute for an editorial derivation from a verbal dynamic, a chain of human choices so long and so thoroughly mediated that the Creator's original voice cannot be identified at its far end. Christos, the supreme revealer in the New Testament tradition, endorsed the Septuagint's Kyrios tradition by his quotation practice, never used or taught the Tetragrammaton, and revealed the Creator's identity through the relational address of Father. Hosea 2 verse 16 places the Lord/Master title category itself under prophetic censure, indicting simultaneously Baal, Adonai, and Kyrios as inappropriate designators of the intimately relational Creator. Egyptian wisdom, which formed Moses at the deepest level of his education and cognition, supplied a conceptual framework, the hidden name of Ammonius, the ontology of divine transcendence through namelessness, that maps precisely onto what the burning bush encounter performs. The Creator refuses a static phonetic name and offers instead a verbal, dynamic, open-ended self-affirmation of ontological sovereignty. The Kenite-Midianite hypothesis adds the possibility that YHWH entered Israelite tradition as a regional tribal theonym, rather than a universal Creator name. Taken singly, any of these arguments is significant. Taken together, they constitute a converging body of evidence from multiple disciplines pointing toward the same conclusion. The Tetragrammaton is a historically conditioned, editorially mediated, scribal designation for the Creator, reverently intended, carefully preserved, deeply meaningful within its tradition, but it cannot bear the weight of the claim that it is the Creator's own, original, eternal, universal self-given name. Section 12. Rebuttal. Answering the strongest counterarguments. An honest and rigorous defense must engage directly with the strongest objections that can be raised against its thesis. The 6 counterarguments addressed in this section represent the most substantive challenges available to the position advanced in this paper. Each is treated seriously and rebutted on its merits. Counterargument I. The antiquity of the Tetragrammaton confirms its authenticity. The inscriptional evidence for the early use of YHWH is substantial and cannot be dismissed. The Mesha stele, dating to approximately 840 BCE, and discovered in 1868 at Dibon in modern Jordan, contains what is widely accepted as one of the earliest extra-biblical attestations of the divine name in Israelite religious usage. The Khirbet el-Kham inscription, dated to approximately 750 BCE, contains a reference to YHWH and his Ehyeh in a burial cave context. The Untitled Chapter inscriptions, discovered in the northern Sinai and dated to approximately 800,750 BCE, contain multiple references to YHWH in combination with geographic designations, YHWH of Samaria, YHWH of Taman, and with the goddess Ehyeh as a companion figure. Together, these inscriptions demonstrate that YHWH was in active use as a divine name in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, considerably earlier than the final compilation of the Masoretic text tradition, and within the period of the Hebrew monarchy. This evidence is historically significant, and the paper does not dispute it. The critical question, however, is what antiquity of use establishes. Antiquity of use demonstrates that a name was used early. It does not demonstrate that the name is primordially original, or that it constitutes the Creator's own self-designation, rather than a human community's designation of the Creator. The Mesha stele is particularly illuminating in this regard. It presents YHWH in an explicitly national and political military context, as the deity of Israel and Judah whose vessels King Mesha dragged before his own deity Chemosh in celebration of military victory. This is the use of YHWH as a national deity name, entirely consistent with the Kenite-Midianite hypothesis that it functioned originally as a regional tribal theonym. Cross, 1973, Albright, 1968. The Untitled Chapter inscriptions complicate the picture further. YHWH in his Ehyeh places the Tetragrammaton within a syncretic, possibly polytheistic religious context, hardly the environment of pure monotheistic divine self-revelation that Tetragrammaton advocates typically presuppose. The antiquity of these inscriptions shows YHWH embedded in the religious pluralism and national politics of the Iron Age Levant, not floating above history as a primordially established universal name. and the manuscript observation applies equally to inscriptions as to manuscripts. A carved inscription is a written artifact made by a human scribe with specific theological commitments. Its use of YHWH demonstrates only that the scribe used it, not that the creator endorsed it as his eternal self-designation. The logic that disqualifies the frequency argument in Section 5 applies with equal force here. Counterargument 2. Deuteronomy uses YHWH hundreds of times. Moses endorsed the name. The counterargument from Deuteronomy is straightforward. If the book presents itself as Moses' own speech, and YHWH appears throughout it, then Moses endorsed and used the name. The observation about YHWH's frequency in Deuteronomy is accurate. The inference is not. YHWH's function throughout Deuteronomy is as a covenant historical identity marker. YHWH your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Not as a phonetic formula advanced for invocation or as a claim about the Creator's eternal self-given name. Moses is invoking covenant history, not performing a phonetic name certification. The distinction between using a name as a functional covenant identifier and asserting that name as the Creator's primordial, original, universal self-designation is not a small distinction. It is precisely the distinction this paper is drawing throughout. Furthermore, Deuteronomy's compositional history must be acknowledged even within the counterargument's own framework. The Deuteronomist school, DTR, identified by scholars from Wellhausen 1878 onward, is responsible for the editorial shape of Deuteronomy as it exists in the canon. The book's theological perspective, its characteristic vocabulary, and its ideological concerns all reflect an editorial tradition active in the late monarchic and exilic periods, not exclusively the hand of Moses at Sinai. Even if Moses stands behind the core of Deuteronomy's tradition, the text as received has passed through editorial formation that carries the Deuteronomist's theological commitments, including its commitment to YHWH as the covenant name. Most decisively, the manuscript argument of Section 1 applies in full. Wherever Deuteronomy shows Lord in an English Bible, this is the translator rendering the Masoretic Tetragrammaton. This rendering cannot tell us what Moses actually said with his mouth in Hebrew, Egyptian, or any other language. The chain of oral tradition, scribal encoding, Masoretic standardization, and English translation is too long and too thoroughly human to serve as direct testimony to Moses' own phonetic usage of the divine name. Counterargument 3. John 17 verse 6 proves Christos actively revealed the divine name. John 17 verse 6, I have revealed your name to those whom you gave me out of the world, is the New Testament passage most frequently cited by Tetragrammaton advocates as proof that Christos actively and intentionally revealed the Hebrew divine name. The argument runs: if Christos revealed the Father's name, and the Father's name is YHWH, then Christos endorsed and revealed YHWH. This argument fails at the level of both lexical analysis and contextual reading. The Greek term onoma, name, carries in its biblical semantic range a meaning that encompasses character, nature, essence, and reputation, not merely phonetic label. This is consistent with its Hebrew counterpart, Shem, which throughout the Hebrew Bible carries the same broad semantic range. When the psalmists speak of trusting in the name of God, they are not advocating phonetic precision. They are speaking of reliance on the Creator's revealed character. When Proverbs declares that the name of YHWH is a strong tower, the tower metaphor points to character and reliability, not to a four-letter sequence. When John 17 is read in its own context, beginning with verse 6 and continuing through the prayer, what Christos identifies as his name revelation is not a phonetic designation but a revelation of relational identity. Unity between the Father and the Son, divine indwelling in the disciples, love as the defining characteristic of the divine human relationship. The name revealed in John 17 is, by the text's internal evidence, the relational identity of the Creator as Father, the revelation that Christos made consistently throughout his ministry through his own characteristic address of Abba. He never, in John 17 or elsewhere, identifies the name he is revealing as YHWH, never spells out a Hebrew sequence, and never instructs his disciples to invoke a four-letter Hebrew name. The Lord's Prayer, delivered as Christos' model of prayer, addresses the Creator as our Father, and treats the name as something to be hallowed, set apart, not casually pronounced. This posture of reverent distance from phonetic name invocation is the opposite of what Tetragrammaton advocacy requires. Finally, and decisively, Christos endorsed the Septuagint tradition by his quotation practice, a tradition in which Kyrios consistently replaced the Tetragrammaton. He never corrected his Greek-speaking audience or his Greek-writing evangelists by insisting on the Hebrew name. The silence is not an accident of transmission. It is the coherent theological posture of one who revealed the Creator's identity through relationship, not through phonetics. Counterargument 4. Hosea 2 verse 16 targets Canaanite Baal specifically, not the Hebrew title Lord. The standard rebuttal to the Hosea 2 verse 16 argument is that the verse is addressed to a specific historical situation, Israel's syncretistic adoption of Canaanite Baal worship, and that the repudiation of Baali, my Baal/my Lord, is targeted at the Canaanite deity specifically, not at the Hebrew title Adonai, or the Greek title Kyrios. The primary referent is indeed the Canaanite deity Baal, and this must be acknowledged fairly. Hosea's historical context is the 8th century BCE, when Baal worship was a persistent challenge to Yahwistic religion in the northern kingdom, and Hosea 2 verse 17 explicitly promises the removal of the names of the Baals, phrased in the plural, indicating the full array of Canaanite Baal deities and their cultic expressions. The rebuttal's limitation, however, is that it addresses only the specific historical referent, while missing the semantic structure of the prophetic declaration. Hosea 2 verse 16 does not say merely, "You will no longer worship Baal." It says, "You will no longer call me Baali, you will call me Ehyeh." The contrast is between two title categories, the Lord/Master/Owner category, Baali, and the Husband/Partner category, Ehyeh. The Creator is not merely rejecting one deity's name. He is rejecting a title category as an appropriate mode of address, replacing it with a title category of intimate partnership. This semantic critique is not constrained by the historical referent to the Canaanite deity alone. It critiques the entire semantic field of lordship as an adequate representation of the divine-human relationship. Adonai means Lord and Master. Kyrios means Lord and Master. Both occupy the same semantic territory as Baali, the territory that Hosea 2 verse 16 identifies as the category to be superseded. The verse's force is not exhausted by its historical occasion. Its semantic logic reaches every subsequent tradition that designates the Creator through the Lord/Master title category. The manuscript irony deserves reiteration here. When the English reader encounters Hosea 2 verse 16 in their Bible, they read, "In that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband, and no longer will you call me my Lord." The translator has placed the Lord, the very Lord title designation, in the introductory formula of a declaration that rejects the Lord title designation. This is not the Creator contradicting himself. It is the translator's convention producing an irony that makes visible, in a single verse, the cascading problem of substituting Lord titles for the divine name. Counterargument v. The ammonious parallel is a category error. Egyptian religion is paganism. Critics of the Egyptian theological parallel advanced in Section 8 frequently raise the objection that invoking a pagan deity, even as a conceptual parallel, is a category error that illegitimately imports foreign theological frameworks into biblical interpretation. The argument runs, Egyptian religion was a polytheistic system producing gods who are fundamentally unlike the monotheistic creator of Genesis. To draw parallels between Ammonius and the God of the Bible is to commit a fundamental error of theological category. This objection, while understandable, proceeds from a misreading of the argument. The claim is not that Ammonius is the same as the Creator, or that Egyptian religious practice should govern biblical theology, or that the God of the Bible is a form of Ammonius. The claim is a conceptual and historical one, that Moses, who was educated in all Egyptian wisdom, Acts 7 verse 22, inhabited a conceptual world that included sophisticated theological reflection on the nature of divine transcendence and the hiddenness of the divine name, and that this conceptual formation shaped the categories through which Moses understood and interpreted his encounter at the burning bush. To dismiss this as irrelevant is, quite precisely, to dismiss what Acts 7 verse 22 canonically claims about Moses' formation. One cannot accept that Moses was educated in Egyptian wisdom, and simultaneously insist that Egyptian wisdom is wholly irrelevant to understanding Moses' theological thinking. Moreover, the characterization of Egyptian religion as simply pagan, and therefore intellectually negligible misrepresents the complexity of New Kingdom Egyptian theology. Ammonius theology in particular moved in directions that scholars including Jan Assmann have characterized as proto-monotheistic. Ammonius was described as the one who conceals himself within all things, the hidden source of all existence, the one whose true name exceeds all designation. Assmann 2001, Smith 2001. This is sophisticated theological reflection, not crude polytheistic mythology. The hidden name concept that Ammonius theology articulates, the idea that the transcendent divine exceeds all phonetic designation precisely because of its transcendence, maps onto what the burning bush encounter itself performs. The Creator refuses a static name, offers a verbal dynamic, and presents himself through fire that burns without consuming. Moses, shaped by Egyptian wisdom, would have recognized in that encounter the ontological logic of the hidden one. The argument is not that paganism validates the biblical text. It is that Moses' own intellectual formation, attested by Scripture itself, provides the conceptual framework through which he would have understood and transmitted his encounter with the divine. Counterargument 6. The 6,828 occurrences cannot be dismissed. That much consistency is meaningful. The most persistent and rhetorically powerful form of the frequency argument does not rely on circularity but on sheer scale. The consistency of the Tetragrammaton across such a vast corpus, from Genesis to Malachi, across dozens of books composed over centuries, cannot, the argument runs, be explained as mere scribal convention. Such consistency across such a span of text must reflect something real, something received, something that preserved itself across all the variations of Israelite history because it was genuinely the divine name. The counterargument deserves a careful and direct rebuttal. Consistency within a single scribal tradition reflects the depth and tenacity of that tradition's commitments. It does not independently verify the historical origin of those commitments. A community that has decided, as a matter of foundational theological conviction, that YHWH is the divine name will consistently apply that conviction across every text it produces, copies, preserves, and standardizes. The greater the community's commitment, the more consistent the application will be, not because the original claim is true, but because committed communities produce consistent texts. This is a sociological and historical reality that applies to all text-producing communities, not a theological judgment about any particular tradition. The Septuagint parallel is again decisive. The Septuagint tradition, produced by a Jewish community, translated from Hebrew originals, spanning an equally large corpus, consistently replaced the Tetragrammaton with Kyrios across the same range of texts. The LXX community's consistency in applying Kyrios is just as thoroughgoing as the Masoretic community's consistency in applying YHWH. If consistency of use across a vast corpus were the criterion for authenticity, the LXX's consistent use of Kyrios would constitute equally strong evidence that Kyrios is the divine name, which no one argues. The two traditions' mutual consistency in opposite directions demonstrates that consistency is a property of committed scribal traditions, not a property that validates any particular tradition's specific claim. The Dead Sea Scrolls add a further complication that undercuts the consistency argument from within. As noted in Section 5, some Qumran manuscripts write the Tetragrammaton in Paleo-Hebrew script within texts otherwise written in Standard Square script, indicating that even within the Hebrew manuscript world of the Second Temple period, there was no single universally observed convention for handling the divine name. Different scribal communities made different choices. The diversity within the Hebrew scribal tradition itself demonstrates that the treatment of the Tetragrammaton was always a matter of community convention, not of unbroken primordial transmission. Consistency within any given community proves that community's consistency. It cannot prove that the community's choice is the one that goes back to the Creator's own voice. The burden of proof lies with those who assert that a specific, historically conditioned, editorially mediated, regionally used, and phonetically uncertain four-letter sequence is the definitive, universal, and original name of the Creator of all existence. The arguments assembled in this paper do not require proof that YHWH is wrong. They require only that the certainty claimed for it cannot be sustained. Every claim about the Tetragrammaton's primordial status must account simultaneously for the editorial nature of Exodus, the Septuagint's Kyrios tradition, the first-person dynamic of Ehyeh, in Exodus 3 verse 14, the silence of Christos, the prophetic critique of Hosea, the conceptual framework of Moses' Egyptian formation, the linguistic consequences of Israel's 430-year Egyptian immersion, and the chain of scribal and translational human choices that stands between any ancient utterance and the English reader's page. When all of these are held in view at once, the appropriate theological posture is not certainty but humility, humility before the hidden one who, at the burning bush and throughout the biblical narrative, consistently eludes every human attempt to capture his essence in a fixed phonetic designation. The one who spoke from the fire was not captured by the fire. Section 13. Conclusion toward a theology of the unnamed and unhidden. This paper has not argued that the Tetragrammaton is false, that those who use it are wrong, or that the creator's identity is entirely inaccessible to human language. The argument has been more precise and more modest, that the certainty with which the Tetragrammaton is claimed to be the creator's original, eternal, self-given name cannot be sustained against the cumulative weight of the textual, manuscript, linguistic, historical, and theological evidence examined across these 13 sections. The goal, therefore, is not replacement, substituting one four-letter sequence for another, but reorientation. A posture of appropriate humility before a creator who has, from the burning bush onward, consistently presented himself as exceeding every human capacity to fix, name, and contain. The burning bush encounter ends not with a static name but with a verbal dynamic, I am what I am. I will be what I will be. An ontological declaration that refuses the very structure of naming. The encounter is with a fire that burns without consuming, a presence that appears without form, a voice that speaks without a visible speaker. Everything about the encounter performs the same theological truth. The creator cannot be captured by any single human designation, however reverently preserved, however frequently repeated, however deeply embedded in a community's scriptural tradition. Hosea points beyond title theology to intimacy, my husband, a relational address that transcends the hierarchies of lordship. Christos reveals the creator as Father, a relational identity that exceeds all phonetics, all scribal conventions, all manuscript traditions. The hidden name of Egyptian ontology, the dynamic I am of Exodus, the relational father of the Gospels, and the prophetic husband of Hosea converge on a single reality. The creator's identity is relational, dynamic, and inexhaustible, not fixed, not phonetic, not bounded by any one language's capacity or any one scribal tradition's choices. To those who open their English Bibles and read the word Lord, know that you are reading a translator's decision, applied to a Masoretic scribe's convention, applied to a vocal substitution tradition, applied to an editorial derivation from a verbal dynamic that the creator used at the burning bush to describe not his phonetic name but his ontological nature. At every layer of that long chain the message is the same. Seek the encounter, not the label. The creator who spoke from fire, who met Moses in a burning bush that refused to be consumed, who presented himself to Israel as a pillar of fire by night, this creator has not hidden from human beings. What he has refused to do is be fully contained by human language, human script, or human tradition. That refusal is not distance. It is the most intimate thing he could do, refusing to be made small enough for any formula to hold, insisting that those who seek him must seek the encounter itself, not merely its echo in the pages of a scribe's manuscript. The unnamed is not the unhidden. He is precisely the one who cannot be named, and precisely the one who is, therefore, always and everywhere near.